Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and in all the time that we've been running this YouTube channel, we have never once explained the character of Batman, and I don't even know if anybody's going to care about this. So, in order to rectify that mistake, over the course of the next 30 minutes, I'm going to make you an expert on the Caped Crusader, the Dark Knight, the guy who dresses as a bat and beats up criminals at night. That dude. So Batman was created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger and first appeared in Detective Comics number 27 in 1939, and the creation of Batman is really a source of a lot of controversy, even today, over 8 decades later. So the creation of Batman was inspired by the success of Superman, who had debuted the previous year, which really prompted National Allied Publications, which would later become DC Comics, to put out a call for more superhero characters. Now here's something that's going to absolutely blow your mind. I kind of a sidetrack for a second. Here's something that's going to blow your mind. National Allied didn't technically become DC Comics. It did, but it didn't. The way this worked at the time is you had National Allied Publications, which was the first real comic book company to exist, if we want to call it that. Shortly after that, you had a company called All American Comics. All American Comics is where you get like Wonder Woman, the original Green Lantern, Alan Scott, different things like that. Eventually, both companies merged, and then you got DC Comics. But according to Bill Finger, Bob Kane called him up and then wanted his opinion on a character that he had planned to submit called the Batman. Now, Finger's account says that Kane's design looked very little like the character that we know today, with a sort of Zorro mask, a pair of bat wings, red tights, no boots or gloves. And Finger says that he took Kane's idea and made substantial changes to his aesthetic so that he now possessed Batman's iconic look, including a full cowl, a cape, and gloves. Now, Bill Finger also says that he came up with Batman's alter ego, Bruce Wayne, by combining the names of the former Scottish King Robert the Bruce and American founding father Mad Anthony Wayne. Now, even though Bob Kane's account of Batman's creation does note Bill Finger's contributions to the character's designs, in the very contract he signed with National Allied Publications, Kane only arranged for his name to appear on the credits of every Batman story, and Bill Finger was not officially recognized as the co-creator of Batman until 2015, which was over 40 years after his death. Imagine you created a character and no one knew that you were instrumental in that character's creation until 40 years after you had passed away. Now, it's not to say that there was never any movement. There had been a movement going on for a long time to finally get some credit going there, but it just took 40 years for it to happen. Now, of course, as always when it comes to these videos, this goes into the origin of Batman. And Batman's comic book origin is one of the most famous in history and has been retold many times with a few tweaks to the story along the way. But it always boils down to these elements. Batman is basically a kid named Bruce Wayne who sees his mommy and his daddy get shot in an alleyway in a mugging gone wrong by a guy named Joe Chill. And then he basically decides that he doesn't want anybody else to suffer that same fate. And so he goes to train to become Batman, and then he comes back to Gotham and he actually makes the city worse by inciting villains that had no reason to exist before he became Batman. Imagine that. You decide you want to fight crime to make the city better and you actually make it worse. That sucks. But after his original introduction into Detective Comics, Batman received his own solo title in 1940, with Bill Finger handling the writing duties and Bob Kane taking care of the art. Now, during this time, Batman appeared in his signature black and gray costume, and it's actually during this time that a great deal of the supporting characters and iconic parts of Batman's arsenal were introduced. A really good example of this is that Robin is introduced as Batman's sidekick in Detective Comics issue number 38 in 1940. Now, the thing about this is that Batman's adventures up to that point in time were solo stories. Batman never really had a sidekick or anything like that, and as popular as he was, DC had actually gained the inspiration for the creation of Robin from Shazam, Billy Batson. And the reason for that is while National Allied had their own publications, of course, as with anything, if you find success doing something, people are going to copy it. And so what it did is it led to a company called Fawcett Publications, which up to that point just produced magazines and stuff. It led to their president basically going to Bill Parker and CC Beck and saying, give me Superman without Superman. Now, of course, this led to Billy Batson being created as a kid who met a guy in a subway station who took him on a magic train ride and then gave him powers. Creepy story if there ever was one. But Billy Batson could shout the word Shazam and basically become Superman. And so that's why DC sued the hell out of Fawcett Publications, took the character, held him for something like 20 years, and then eventually brought him back. The popularity of Billy Batson as a kid who could become a superhero could not be ignored. And so this drove DC DC to basically bring in Robin, realizing that having a kid, even if he was only a sidekick, was so incredibly popular that it would actually boost the sales of Batman's comics, which it did. Of course, Batman's arch nemesis, the Joker, was introduced in April of 1940 and actually made his first appearance in Batman #1. But the next year, the Penguin was introduced in Detective Comics #58, and the Scarecrow made his debut in World's Finest #3. And then, of course, the year after that saw the introduction of Two-Face in Detective Comics issue #66. Now, all of these characters were at least co-created by Bill Finger and Bob Kane, so it is impossible to overstate the importance of these two men on the overall Batman mythos. Now, Bill Finger is also widely credited with the creation of most of the iconic accessories and weapons that have become a part of Batman's character. He created the Batcave, including the famous trophies like the full-size T-Rex and a giant penny, and he created the Batmobile. Now, really, the only thing he didn't create were the Batarangs, which were actually created by Gardner Fox, who had to write some of the issues to help with delays on the title. But one of the key differences between the earliest versions of Batman and the current one is that at the beginning, Batman did not have a problem with killing, and several criminals met their demise at his hands. I mean, quite literally, there's a story where it's like these escaped maniacs, and I think it's Detective Comics, but there's a story where these escaped maniacs, and one of them gets hung from the Batmobile. Literally, Batman hangs the guy from the Batmobile, and he's like, he's better off this way. Something to know, man, back in the 40s, back in the golden age of comics, they didn't care, man. Heroes would kill people. But the reality here is that Batman rapidly became one of DC's most popular superheroes, so he was frequently featured in crossovers with a bunch of other characters, particularly Superman. Now, Batman's first crossover with Superman actually came in Superman issue #76, and this was a monumental event that happened. And the reason why is because up to that point in time in DC Comics, we can just call it that, everybody just kind of existed in their own little world. You didn't really know if Gotham was on the same Earth as like Metropolis, right? If like Superman was just right over there. There was no way to really know if that was the case. But by having Batman and Superman cross over, it basically created a shared universe. Now we knew that Superman's just right over there, and Wonder Woman is right over there. And it'd be very easy for these characters to cross over, and in fact, they did. What's kind of ironic about this, though, is that the initial crossover between Batman and Superman was a bit of a misnomer. So what you had was a comic called World's Finest, who actually had Batman, Superman, and Robin on the front cover. And the initial belief is that World's Finest was the first real crossover between these two characters. It wasn't. Superman #76 in 1952 was the first real crossover. The reason why that comic is believed to be the case is because of the cover, but in reality, on the inside, it's just a series of individual stories about Batman and Superman, and they never actually meet. But crossovers between Superman and Batman after issue #76 became incredibly common. And in fact, team-ups between them usually appeared in the World's Finest comics in issue #71 in 1954. But Batman was also part of the original Justice League of America, which was a team that was made up of DC's most popular superheroes and was introduced in 1960 to capitalize on a resurgence in the popularity of superhero comics. Now, one of the reasons why I want to throw this out here, and this is kind of an important thing to understand, and we'll revisit this over the course of different DC character explanation videos that we make, is that by the time World War II came to an end, superheroes weren't popular anymore. And a lot of that was because of the fact that superheroes gained popularity by tying into World War II. And so it was like a total war effort, right? Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, they were all facing off against the Axis powers. And so while you didn't really see members of the Axis leadership named particularly, the message was pretty clear, right? You know, these superheroes support the Allied troops, and so should you. But by the time World War II ended, people were tired of war, and so they didn't want to read comics that literally dealt with superheroes fighting over in other wars. But because the popularity of superheroes was born and bred in war itself, when they removed the wartime element from the comics, they simply just stopped selling. Now, the other part of this is that in lieu of people having spent so long focusing on war, they wanted to let their imaginations go crazy. So what they did is they started focusing on science fiction. That's the reason why you'll hear about the names of DC writers like Edmund Hamilton, because he was instrumental in growing the science fiction genre. But the reason this is important is because in the mid-1950s, what you had was a guy named Julius Schwartz, who basically brought in a superhero named Barry Allen, also known as the Flash. And Barry Allen was the first time that DC bridged the gap between superheroes and science fiction, even though you would think superheroes would inherently be science fiction. But Barry Allen got his powers by literally being just doused in chemicals and struck by lightning, and suddenly he could run at super speed. By whatever manner and whatever means, people at that point in time differentiated comics and science fiction. They were just two distinctly different things. I don't know. But the thing about it is that the introduction of Barry Allen just skyrocketed interest in comics. People became way more interested in it after that than they had been during about this 10-year lull or so between the end of World War II and the time that DC Showcase number 4 came out in 1956. But comics in general came under fire during the 1950s with the publication of a book called Seduction of the Innocent. And the long and short of this is that some just crazy ass guy came to the belief that anything that he disagreed with was corrupting America's kids. And so what he did was basically try to get Congress to pass laws that would restrict what it was that comics couldn't talk about. But a lot of parents believed the same thing, right? Comic books were corrupting kids. So in fact, Congress was going to pass legislation to do that. In response, the comic book industry passed its own rules called the Comics Code Authority. You guys probably heard of that. We've talked about it before, but it was literally just a governing body with a code of conduct on what comics could or could not cover. The reality is that because Batman's comics were so dark that he was, by all standards of measurement, a vigilante, taking the law into his own hands, different things like that. And so this meant that Batman's comics became a lot more comical. In 1964, to combat struggling sales, Batman was given an overhaul by artist Carmine Infantino at the request of DC editorial. Now, Batman's look was entirely updated, and the character returned to really more grounded detective stories instead of focusing on outlandish adventures. The problem with this is that this change was short-lived. The reason for that being is because the Adam West Batman show was basically predicated on the Batman comics as they'd been created during the era when the Comics Code Authority had the most control over what DC could publish. So by the time DC wanted to put Batman back to his more grounded and semi-violent detective roots, people actually rejected it because they loved the show with Adam West and they wanted to see that show reflected in the comics. But in 1969, the tone of the character just completely shifted yet again when we ended up getting Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams, who came on as writer and artist. Now, the thing about this is that Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams, their run is landmark. In fact, whenever Neil Adams would go to a Comic-Con, he would literally just be surrounded by the entire omnibus run of his works as Batman. But the thing about this is they had made their bones with like Green Arrow, Green Lantern, particularly the story Snowbirds Don't Fly, which is when you basically learned that Green Arrow's sidekick Speedy was essentially using heroin, which flew in the face of everything the Comics Code Authority stood for, and in fact was one of the early stories that actually began to eat away and chip away at the role the Comics Code Authority played, because people were starting to buy DC Comics whether or not they had the seal of approval from the Comics Code on them. But the reality here is that O'Neil and Adams made this deliberate effort to essentially remove the campy elements from Batman stories and really recapture the old Bill Finger and Bob Kane original version of the character that had a gritty detective feel to it. And in fact, this run has become incredibly influential to the character and is legendary with fans. But sales of Batman's title continued to fall throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, completely bottoming out in 1985. Now, this led to one of the single most important decisions that DC would ever make for the character of Batman. And in fact, had they not made this story, we would not have Batman comics. So the thing about this is that at the time when Batman sales were just slumping, there was a guy over at Marvel Comics who was writing Daredevil comics and setting the world on fire. And this guy's name was Frank Miller. I'm sure tons of you guys already predicted that. And the thing behind this is that Frank Miller's writing style was just visceral and it just hit you in all the right ways. And so what DC did in 1985 is they launched Crisis on Infinite Earths, because in addition to Batman's comics struggling, what you had was just the overly complicated nature of the multiverse. You had Crisis on Earth 1, you had Crisis on Earth 2, you had all these crisis events, right? Or at least those two real crisis events, but you had different versions of characters from across the multiverse. So it was just ridiculously difficult for somebody who had never read a comic once in their life to walk into a comic book store in 1979 and tell somebody they wanted to read Batman and to know exactly how it all fit in continuity. It was just an unmitigated mess, all thanks to the Flash of Two Worlds story back in the 60s, which introduced the multiverse to DC Comics. And so because Batman sales were struggling and because Crisis on Infinite Earths was going to reboot the entirety of the multiverse and in a lot of ways give DC Comics a fresh start, DC editorial was considering canceling Batman. And so what they said is, we're going to give this guy one shot, right? We're going to create a single Batman comic and we're going to see how it performs. We're going to give it to Frank Miller. If this guy is just popular as he is, if he can't sell Batman comics, no one can. And so they gave Frank Miller Batman and they said, just give us a story. We don't care what you do, just give us a story. And Frank Miller wrote Dark Knight Returns, one of the single greatest Batman stories to ever be told. And in fact, the story that saved Batman from cancellation. And so Frank Miller followed up The Dark Knight Returns with a retelling of Batman's early days in Batman Year One, which basically tells the story of Batman's return to Gotham after having been away for 12 years and basically training. But it also happens to be the first year in Gotham for Commissioner Gordon as well. And this was another insanely well-received Batman story from Frank Miller, and really cemented his place as perhaps the most influential writer on the character except for Bill Finger himself. And in fact, Frank Miller would write the character a few more times, with The Dark Knight Strikes Again in 2002, All-Star Batman and Robin, The Boy Wonder in 2005, and The Dark Knight 3 Master Race in 2015. But in addition to like delays and all that kind of stuff, a lot of people just found pretty much all the stories regarding Batman that Frank Miller wrote after The Dark Knight Returns and Year One to just not be all that great. They were rough. But regardless of how Frank Miller's later work had been received, the reality is that the work that he had done was just landmark, and it quite literally not only saved Batman, but because Batman defeated Superman, and Superman had his own host of issues on the publishing side with Julius Schwartz and Sand Superman and all that kind of stuff, that basically it led to Batman overtaking Superman in popularity. And so the 1990s brought a new era of over-the-top muscles and like ultra-modern costumes to comic books in general, and Batman was no exception. The biggest example of this came during the 1993 storyline Nightfall, which actually introduced Bane to Batman's rogues gallery and then just super elevated him to the top of like Batman's most dangerous foes, because the Nightfall story arc literally saw Bane breaking Batman's back after deducing his identity, having only been there for 3 months. Bane was a hoss when he was first introduced. Nowadays he kind of sucks, but back then he was really amazing. But of course, the paralyzing of Batman at the hands of Bane saw Azrael essentially taking over, and he was a far more edgier and a more brutal version of Batman until of course Bruce Wayne returned to retake the mantle. But of course, what really helped to solidify the Batman comics and basically continuing to grow in popularity was stuff like Batman in 1989 by Tim Burton, and like Batman the Animated Series by Bruce Timm and Paul Dini, Batman Mask of the Phantasm, which is still the greatest Batman movie ever made, and I don't care what anybody says. But the fact that a lot of people were watching these TV shows or these films or what have you, and then learning about the character for the first time, it resonated with them. And the fact that they went to go read the comics, which for the most part lined up with what they saw, kept them reading the comics, and that's how DC ended up with lifelong fans. But the other big run on Batman comics that should really be mentioned here during this point in time is Grant Morrison's run in the mid-2000s, which is still considered one of the best Batman runs by a lot of different fans. And there were really two big developments of the character that came from Morrison's time in writing. The first was the introduction of Damien Wayne, who's the son of Bruce Wayne and Talia al Ghul, who would go on to become the fourth version of Robin. Now, of course, Damien is still a huge part of Batman's supporting cast and is really a divisive character, but watching Batman come to terms with being a father added a whole new element to the character that hadn't really been seen before. But of course, the apparent death of Bruce Wayne that happened during the events of Final Crisis was another major thing for his character, because the effects spill over into Batman as Dick Grayson, the original Robin, ends up taking up the mantle of Batman with Damien Wayne as his Robin. Now, of course, Bruce Wayne was not actually dead during the events of Final Crisis because he was just too popular to kill, which is really his major power. I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. The real superpower of Batman is that he's too popular to cancel. And so ultimately, he ended up returning in a story aptly titled The Return of Bruce Wayne, ended up back in the modern era, retook the mantle of Batman from Dick Grayson, and has just kind of been around ever since. But while there were a lot of different stories being told about Batman in the 2000s that we really just haven't mentioned here, I would say probably the next significant moment for the character's publication history came with DC's New 52 reboot in 2011. Now, this popularity with Batman came from a couple different reasons. The first was because DC's New 52 just total reworking of their landscape was highly publicized. I mean, it was a great big huge marketing blitz that DC put on, right? Have you never read DC comics before? Great! Now's the time to get on, and it worked, specifically for the character of Batman. And a lot of this was because of the fact that Scott Snyder was the guy who was writing. When Scott Snyder took over the title of Batman, I mean, he blew the doors off, right? Like, he literally came out guns blazing with his story, The Court of Owls. Now, the reason reason why this story was so significant is because Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo's run did not drastically alter the character, but was extremely popular with readers and did introduce a major addition to Batman's Rogues Gallery with the Court of Owls themselves, which was basically a secret society of criminals that had been operating in Gotham ever since the city's founding. Now, the beauty of this story is that it did not treat it as some kind of MacGuffin or some kind of nonsensical thing. It was written in a way to where it was believable that the court was so incredibly secretive that the world's greatest detective didn't know they were operating right under his nose. But the writing style of Scott Snyder and the artistry of Greg Capullo just captivated fans, and it was hugely popular. But one of the big things that you saw when it came to their run as well was the highly publicized return of the Joker and Death of the Family and Batman Endgame, both of which were just massively popular stories. And this right here is what solidified and made Batman's run during the New 52 so phenomenal with fans. But in addition to having a high-selling and exceedingly loved solo title, the New 52 further cemented Batman's place as a pillar of the DC Universe, and that he was a founding member of the New 52 version of the Justice League by Jeff Johns and played a prominent role in that book throughout its entire run. And in fact, Batman was also at the center of several crossovers that spread across multiple titles as DC tried to use his popularity to improve the sales of other titles. And in addition to the regular monthly titles that featured Batman, DC launched 2 different weekly series centered around him as well, because it became obvious that Batman sold books, and DC intended to milk his popularity for all it was worth, in a trend that has continued in DC to this day. However, there were some issues where I'm not painting this picture that Batman's comics at the time were absolutely perfect. One of the bigger problems that you had here is that when DC launched the New 52 and we picked up with Batman, the explanation is those characters had only been around for 5 years. So it had been 5 years between the time that Bruce Wayne had essentially first arrived in Gotham City and when we saw him as Batman as we knew him. Now, this kind of explanation of how he became Batman was actually explained in a story called 0 Year by Scott Snyder. It was a 3-part story. It was absolutely wonderful. But what fans had a hard time accepting is that when characters like Bane were introduced, or when things like the death of Jason Todd, who was Robin at the hands of the Joker, was still a thing in his continuity, that all of that was expected to have happened in 5 years. That within the span of 5 years, Jason Todd had been killed by the Joker, that Bane had broke Batman's back, just all those things. Fans had an exceedingly difficult time swallowing that pill, and it seemed just really silly. But the reality was, as popular as his comics were, while there were grumbles and gripings about those kinds of things, the writing of Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo basically led to a lot of fans to just kind of sweep that little tidbit under the rug and just focus on how great the stories were, ignoring a lot of the major continuity errors that existed. And so in 2016, DC relaunched its entire line of comics, and while they did not reboot their continuity as they had with the New 52, all of their titles were basically given new creative teams, including Batman. Now, this led to one of the more divisive eras of Batman's writing, because when Scott Snyder left the title, it led to a guy named Tom King coming on and basically taking his place. Now, the reality is that as soon as Tom King came on, he announced that his run would actually total 100 issues, although it was received with a pretty lukewarm reception. And in fact, his highly anticipated 100-issue run was actually shortened to the longest 85-issue run I've ever read in my life. It did have cool stories, don't get me wrong. It did have some cool stories. I Am Gotham, I Am Bane, different things like that. Those were just great stories, right? The War of Jokes and Riddles, phenomenal stories. Absolutely love those. It was everything in between that just drug on. The reality here, if I'm kind of injecting my own opinion, the reality here is that Tom King's entire Batman run just really felt like him patting himself on the back, and it was like a love letter to himself, right? It was almost him just kind of getting full on what it was that he was doing, and it just didn't feel as great as it could have been. And in reality, I wasn't really alone in feeling this. But a big reason for the fan disappointment in Tom King's run was that the run seemed poised to deliver just this huge change to Batman's status quo, because there were a bunch of issues that led up to a promised marriage between Batman and Catwoman, which was set to take place in issue number 50. And I kid you not, right? I kid you not. What this guy did, and I don't know if it was DC editorial, I don't know if it was Tom King, it was the biggest gotcha. Like that's literally what it was. The biggest moment like that ever. Everybody was looking forward to this. People who were reading Tom King's run were like, yes, right? Batman and Catwoman are finally gonna get married. They've been docking the boots for God only knows how long. They've been doing everything but being married. The writing between the two of them in terms of how they talked was a little weird, but we were all excited for it. And then literally Catwoman's like, there has to be a Batman. And if you marry me, then, there won't really be a Batman anymore or something like that. And then she just bailed on him. She literally left him at the altar and the two of them never got married. And so the result of this is that a lot of people, including myself, felt like it was just a giant bait and switch, that it was a way for DC to kind of build up this event that was going to happen. And like, you got to read the story so you know what's going on. And never actually had any intention of having Batman and Catwoman get married. People felt tricked. It was like a smaller, more scaled down version of the death of Superman in the 1990s when DC was like, Superman's going to die, guys. So you got to, it's going to be a great big huge thing. He's going to be dead and gone. He's never going to come back. And then they brought him back and people felt tricked. They felt like his death didn't mean anything and the sales of Action Comics never recovered. But people felt like that with the Batman run by Tom King. What this did is it led to just this catastrophic drop off of the stories and people stopped reading Tom King's Batman after that. But 2017 basically saw the ending of the DC Rebirth initiative, right? That's when the whole thing basically began to wrap up. And the reality here is that Batman's character is still evolving and it is still changing, right? He's still kind of having a few things thrown in and so on and so forth. And again, there's some of the things that we didn't talk about that are still having effects to this day. For example, Batman Incorporated, that one of the things that Batman had done during Grant Morrison's run is he has actually traveled around the world and essentially created a Batman team in different places around the world. A lot of those effects are still being felt right now. There's things like Ghostmaker, who's basically somebody that Bruce Wayne had trained with in his younger years that initially started off as a sort of friendly rivalry, but Ghostmaker was a lot more intense than Batman was. But Tom King's run is really the last complete run for Batman that we saw. There were some things that were done in DC's Future State, which I kind of read a little bit, but ultimately ended up bailing out on. But as always, again, his character is changing and evolving. But with that being said, guys, let me know what you think about this new video format for character explanations. Honestly, I love it. I think it's really, really cool. But let me know what you guys think. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.